My guest on this episode of Suds Search is Jeff Ferguson. Jeff is a partner and the head of the production team at Amplitude Digital. He is an industry veteran with over 25 years of experience in digital marketing. In that time, he's worked with large organizations like Belkin, CPS, eHarmony, Manchester United, Paychex, Sony, and many others. He is a regular presenter at conferences such as AdTech, All Facebook Expo, Conversion Conference, eMetrics, and SMX. He's also a professor at UCLA, where he teaches classes in advanced digital marketing and search engine optimization. Earlier this year, Jeff wrote an article for Search Engine Journal titled, "Do We Have the Math to Truly Decode Google's Algorithms?" The article quickly gained interest on Twitter and throughout the SEO community. We're going to spend a lot of our conversation discussing some of the points made in the article. Prior to joining Amplitude, Jeff owned his own agency, Fang Marketing. I'm going to ask him about the experience of getting acquired during a global pandemic. Jeff is also a lot of fun to have a beer with. Bonus points to Jeff for bringing an imperial coffee stout from Gigantic Brewing Company with an unforgettable picture of Sam Jackson on the front of it. Join us for a conversation that scrutinizes all the tools SEOs use, the studies we rely on for information, and learn a little bit about gentlemen scientists. Jeff Ferguson, thanks for coming on Suds Search. How are you doing today?
My pleasure. I'm doing great.
Well, this is the first time I've met you. I'd love to learn just a little bit about your background. I know you're a professor at adjunct professor at UCLA. I want to make sure I get it right. And right. An agency owner. You've been acquired. Give me a little bit of a background on you and for our listeners.
Sure. So I've been around digital marketing for 25 years now. I actually got started back in '95, and kind of accidentally, as a lot of people in the business did. Although my kind of degree set really, did nicely, for getting into the business. I came out with degrees in computer science and communications, and originally wanted to be like a copywriter, and that's kind of like I set out sending resumes out to different companies saying, hey, this is what I want to do, and I've got this this technical background and how handy it's going to be and stuff like that. But everybody wanted to talk about the internet, even though it was '95. But they just people knew that something was coming. They just didn't know what it was. And I had played around with the internet obviously since all throughout college and things like that, and the web was just starting to become out and become a thing. And the first couple of times I got asked about it, they'd go like, what do you know about this? And I go, well, no more than anybody, whatever, and it was just a thing. It wasn't something I was really focusing on. And then I got my first invoice for my student loan. And the next interview I went on, I said, I know everything about the internet. I'm an internet pro and can do anything you want on this side. And ended up getting that job and a little company that doesn't exist anymore, but had to run out and buy a big book on HTML and a bunch of other stuff. And started off as kind of like a webmaster / marketing associate, and did that for a few years. And then got recruited as the internet boom really kind of kicked in full speed. I got recruited into Hilton Hotels Corporation and was their first head of digital over there, which was a real blast, and did that for several years and loved it every moment when I was over there. And then kind of after the travel industry took a powder after 9/11, I ended up over at Kimberly-Clark. It was the only time I really ever lived anywhere besides California, and was kind of like their first of digital when it came to at least advertising and media over there, and kind of brought that house and everything in house. And then got homesick, came back to California, and worked for companies like Napster. I worked for another large agency for a while, one of the IPG family, a few others, just different companies. Eventually, just kind of decided after like 15 years in that business, decided that I wanted to start my own business, and started Fang Digital back about a little bit over a decade ago now. And we did all kinds of clients, every shape and sizes. We did a lot of SEO work and paid search work, and we're basically a full service agency when it came right down to it, and staffed up and grew and just had a great time, and worked in some really fun accounts like the Smithsonian and Manchester United and Sony Pictures and some real great big nameplate type stuff. But we also helped a lot of like small and medium sized businesses get their start and work up from there. And then at the beginning of this year, right in the middle of the COVID, pandemic and everything, we merged with another company, Amplitude, and now we're part of a much larger family, and have a lot more services and a bunch of other stuff. And so I kind of took on the role as I'm obviously one of the partners of the business, but I'm also kind of head of production. So I run the team that handles, all the paid search and paid social and programmatic and SEO and the whole bit to it. So I've got that whole thing where my partners are kind of focused on other parts of the business, which is exactly what I wanted to have happen, because that was my least favorite part of running my own business, was all the finance and all the other kind of stuff to it. So I happily took on the role that I'm in now, and it gives me more time to do a lot of other stuff too, as far as I started writing a lot more. I've got more time to write on my book and a bunch of other things. So it's been fun and interesting.
You don't miss P&Ls at all or anything?
Not at all. No.
Payroll stress and all that stuff.
It doesn't. Yeah, it's that kind of stuff just was never my bag. I remember the day that I got big enough that I could actually hire an accountant to get it off my desk was like the best day of the business. I was going, well, no, it can't get any better from here. I just don't have to touch this kind of stuff anymore. And money just appeared in the bank, and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't something where I wasn't chasing clients down and all that kind of stuff. So it's much better. But now it's even more so, because they really, I think the most financial thing I have to worry about now is doing my is approving hours and doing my expense reports. That's about it.
That's about it. You can deal with that. All right.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things I'd love to ask you about. I'd love to hear about the merger and how that all went down. But there was an article you wrote in Search Engine Journal in July. We're filming this. It's now towards the end of August of 2020. That made some waves. I just thought it'd be worth really going through this very slowly. You start this out. You start this out with this great story. What does this have to do with gentleman scientists, William Mulholland, and a dam breaking and killing between 400 and 1,000 people?
Yeah, no kidding. So it's one of the things where the connection there was this idea that of the 25 years that I've been in the business, SEO has always been there, and why it wasn't always called SEO, it was part of it. I remember I called it organic marketing back when I first started doing it and everything. And one of the early things I really noticed was that there were a lot of people that were taking this very scientific looking approach to how they were doing SEO, or at least how they were talking about how they discovered how certain aspects of SEO worked, right? And
absolutely,
they'd blog about it, do whatever. And I think in those early days of it, maybe in the first decade or so, it was something where somebody would go hey, look, I noticed that that the title tag is the same title tag that they use for the title and the thing, and that makes sense to do this. Or they'd come back and say, it's this many characters, or it's this kind of stuff, or they'd get a confirmation from Google says, yes, we definitely look at at that content, the title tag. There's no argument against that kind of stuff, right? Things like that were very common and very easy. And and every now and then you'd hear somebody come out with something where maybe they dig into a patent application or something cool like that, and kind of say, hey, this is interesting. Google says this, and maybe we should pay attention to that, or whatever. And again, interesting, fairly harmless. And I think everybody was just on board with this concept that we don't know all the inner workings of Google and some of these other search engines, but we've got some pretty good ideas and stuff. And Google itself would come back and tell you certain things and say, yes, we definitely do that. This is cool, whatever it is. But at some point, and I think it was the rise of a lot of the big SEO tools that were out there that actually, started coming up with their own indexes, or they're doing a lot more heavy duty scraping or whatever it is that they're pulling this data together. There was a lot more of these studies that started getting published, right? And these guys would, they pull in sometimes they pull in a data scientist, sometimes they wouldn't, sometimes they just, they just look at a bunch of data and do this. And you started getting these very, again, very scientific looking proclamations from these tools that would come out and say, hey, look, we ran the numbers on this stuff, and we can say that this is clearly you know, because of this equals this,
Right.
and this is the way this kind of works. And sometimes they would use the you know, at least the right kind of language where they say, hey, this correlates with this, because
Right.
they'd actually find somebody that actually knew a little bit about statistics, and they say this is this, but they really wouldn't clarify things enough to specifically state, hey, look, you know, this doesn't necessarily mean that this is causing this. It's just that they're related, and that should be whatever. So they never went to all the trouble of really explaining stuff. And, you know, eventually they'd start doing caveats where they'd go like, hey, just a reminder that, you know, correlation doesn't mean causation, and, you know, take this for it or whatever. But the damage was still getting done, right? You still had people running off and saying, hey, look, I saw a post up on Moz that said, you know, Google +1s help with ranking, or that, you know, that, or social media in general helps with ranking, or any number of things, right? You know, specific things where we'd see some kind of study that said, you know, the specific number of words in an article helps specifically, right? You know, it was something where they were trying to make these really specific proclamations. And that's where I started getting really uptight about this kind of stuff, as I'm going, this is dangerous, right? And you know, you've been in the business too, and you've probably had to encounter and almost kind of like deprogram your clients with this kind of information in hand, because they come at you and say like, well, why aren't you doing this? Because I read an article that said this was important, or, you know, we should do this kind of stuff. Yeah. It's just it's a constant battle of stuff. And I remember there's multiple times where I would call these, you know, the owners of these tool sets, or whoever the spokesperson was, out on these things and saying, like, you guys got to be really careful with this stuff. It's causing problems. Like, it's making more work for us that actually have to do this stuff for a living. And, you know, I wouldn't say they didn't care. It's one of the things where they would do a very typical shrug to say like, hey, look, that's not my responsibility, right? It's something where like, I just present this data, I just present this finding. It's in the spirit of learning and things like that.
Sure.
And they certainly had their supporters as well, because they say, hey, look, that inspires a certain amount of tests and things like that I can do, which, you know, I get, that's kind of cool. But in the end, a lot of the stuff was, you know, they were getting told specifically by the search engines to say like, well, it's just not true at all. Like, what, you know, what just came out there, that was completely inaccurate. Right. Where we're telling you it's inaccurate, don't do that. It's actually bad for, you know, you, whatever it is. Or they'd say, you know, maybe there should be some report that says, hey, look, the number of, you know, maybe clicks was a big thing, or click-through rate or something along those, or bounce rate or whatever was a good indicator. And they'd come back and Google or whatever would try and explain it and say, hey, look, you're close. It's not that specifically. It's something where we use that as a good way to test things, or we feed it to our machine learning algorithms to figure stuff out. And that's why it's connected. And so that's why you're getting these very close numbers, but it's not a one-to-one thing to say it's like, this is causing this, whatever it is. And then they would just ignore them. They say, well, you know, if you want to believe, you know, the big bad search engines, you can do that kind of stuff. And, and I think I'd just gotten to a certain point where I was going like, man, I just want to tear this down. Like, I just want to that kind of idea is that we need to have a systematic shift in the understanding of like why the way these reports were done were so bad, and why they're so dangerous, and what the problems were. And I had done
there's someone in this article I want to get to, which is important. She's I think the star of the article. And,
absolutely.
And her name is Jen Hood. She is really important in terms of breaking this stuff down, and she really is a statistician. She actually does this for a living. Knew nothing about SEO. How did you get to know her? And maybe give a little background. Who is she, and how did you get to know her?
Sure. So believe it or not, so I'd done an article on SEJ before, which was it was this kind of the legality of the featured snippet and things like that. And as part of the process, I'd used Help a Reporter Out, or HARO, to kind of reach out for a bunch of actual lawyers to give me information on this one. Sorry if this is getting loud, my guys.
It's okay.
Yeah. And it worked fantastically. Like, I actually got a bunch of great lawyers that actually showed up and quoted, and we had these great conversations and things like that. And so when it came time to actually write this article, I said, oh, I'm going to do the same thing, right? I've got like an outline of what I wanted to do, but I really wanted somebody that actually had some real authority in the game that could prove stuff, rather than me, who was the first to admit that, like, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a statistician.
This is sort of the point you're trying to make.
It's exactly. Yeah. And so I did a HARO outreach, and oddly enough, finding statisticians is a little harder than it is for finding lawyers in this business, right?
Yeah, it's hard to believe. Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I only got 2 responses this time. One of them was for, she was actually a professor at a college, and said it would actually make a fantastic study. Like, it's one of the things where she said, like, if I ever, went back to school and got my doctorate, that would be a great theory, kind of stuff to do for my paper, whatever it is. But she said, like, we really couldn't do enough for it. It wouldn't be enough to do it. And I said, well, maybe yes and no, but it is what it is, right? Super loud.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah.
Sorry for your distraction.
So anyway, but the other one, Jen Hood, came back and said, I find this completely interesting. This is like a fascinating subject to it. She was, in addition to being a statistician, she was a, small business owner as well. She was a consultant for this type of stuff. She had worked for Volvo for years as a way to do it. So she was used to working for companies that dealt with complex systems in the same way that Google does, right? Google's super complex, so are cars, right? And so she dealt with all that kind of numbers. And so I, basically laid out the idea of like, hey, look, I've got these thoughts and stuff. I'm not going to, like, I'll guide you and I'm going to show you certain things, certain studies and things like that, but I'm not going to tell you like that I think they're wrong or right or anything like that. I just want to get your opinions on these things. Right. And so I started basically funneling her just tons of different reports and then gave her all the time in the world to actually come back with it.
So then she looked at these reports and she found that SEOs are beyond reproach, and we are unbelievably good in our vigor.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah.
Now, what did she start to find out? I'm obviously joking, but
so yeah, I mean, she started almost immediately. She was kind of saying like, it was going like, these are like really unethical. Like there were some things where like just the way it was actually approached, there was some really unethical stuff that was happening on how they were presented or how the information presented or things like that. There was just a ton of information that was either left out, or if it was included, ended up actually like proving that nobody should be using this data or whatever it is. And it was like time after time after time. And what ended up in the article, like, I think we focused on like 5 different studies. And even then one of those studies ended up, having like 2 or 3 other studies that it was connected to that we talked about as well. But like, that was after I had sent her probably like a dozen that she had actually looked at over time. So there were way more than we actually looked at, and it was the same problem over and over again. So we consolidated down to basically say like, this is the same problem that was coming up over and over again, or this is the, things. And it was nuts. It was, it was kind of nutty thing. And
these are all the biggest tools in our industry, the things that people who speak at conferences always bring up. This is how we're making sense of our profession. Yeah, exactly. Over and over again. Like it's the kind of stuff that happens and certain, metrics that are built in some of these tools. Some of the tools themselves were born out of this type of thinking. Right. And I'm going, my goodness, like that's just a lie, right? And it's something where, again, and I did point that out in the article where I said, hey, I don't want to make these guys off as like charlatans or that are just like, snake oil hucksters or anything like that. I think they do have the best intentions in mind where they're kind of coming up with it. But I think it's a very common bias to do things like to say, hey, look, we're going to make this fit to what my theory is on these things because it makes for a great story, or, it makes you in a certain amount of hero to do this kind of things. And I just think those days are past. Like I think the SEO industry have just grown up beyond that kind of stuff, that we don't need to do it anymore. And but I also think we've got tons of really smart people that if they could do it, they could do it the right way, right? And other people have done it. Like actually this week, one of my fellow Search Engine Journal writers, Mika, put an article out. It was amazingly well written that talked about exactly how you can do it. Like this is exactly the way that this needs to be done. These are the right type of models you need to do it. We need to get into peer reviews. We need to do the kind of stuff. The peer review thing was like so logical, massive. But there is no peer review. I mean, it's like, oh yeah. To the extent that there is, it's the same company reviewing their own stuff. That's totally, every year. Yeah, they used to basically come back and said, yeah, we did this last year. We thought about it and we changed it a little bit this year. It goes, that's not actually a peer review. Just like,
I remember, there were a couple of people that did push back on this and kind of said like, we've got real problems with this and whatever. And one of the statisticians that I actually called out in it, he actually admitted that he didn't like the way that this data was being used. The head of marketing for SEMrush, she came back and said like, we can do better, which is really what I wanted everybody to do, is say, hey, we can do better than this. But there were still a couple of them that just, all they took it as like a personal insult and said, well, and oddly enough, the people that did are pretty close to being Mulhollands themselves. They're not killing anybody, but like, as far as their backgrounds and things like that, they go that they're educated, they're smart people, they've done a lot of studies on this stuff, or maybe they get people that actually do know how to do this stuff, but they're not really like statisticians on this stuff.
I think it's so good. This term you use throughout, this gentleman scientist. What does that mean exactly for our listeners?
Oh, sure. I guess it's this concept of, I guess back in the 1800s, actually, it's probably even further back than that, but it used to be this idea that you didn't need a formal education for certain things because that just wasn't a concept back then. But you could just say, hey, look, I could study up on this kind of stuff, and congratulations, I'm an expert. And in the article, I used Mulholland as a great example. And if you grew up in Los Angeles, you knew Mulholland, but he was also like, technically portrayed in the movie Chinatown. If you ever saw Chinatown, that's that he was they actually split him to two different characters in that movie for what it is. But he was a great example of a gentleman scientist in the sense that he wasn't an engineer. He was a ditch digger like for this, but he studied at night. He'd get all these different books on different topics and things like that, and kind of worked his way up the chain, which a lot of people used to do back then. I mean, my grandfather was one of them. My grandfather wasn't a rocket scientist, but he started working for Rockwell right after he got out of the Army after World War II, and kind of worked his way up the chain. So he was in management. But the difference is that he wasn't trying to build space shuttles on his own. He had a team that was doing it. He was just a management, right? But Mohan basically like fancied himself an actual engineer and started designing stuff and doing things, whatever it is. And he'd say, hey, look, we're going to build this dam just outside of Los Angeles, and it's going to be great. And, it's going to hold all this water, and it'll be great for when droughts come and all this kind of stuff. And he built this thing, and almost immediately it started showing problems. It was, there was different cracks, and, I said, well, that's just settling. That happens, or whatever it is. But meanwhile, like an entire village of people had like sprung up in the space that was used to have water in it, was now blocked out and right in the way of the dam, and including the people that took care of the dam and did whatever. But like, it was a little community that propped up there, and they started saying like, hey, I think there's some real problems here. Like, this isn't a regular leak, this is whatever. And then one night the dam literally burst, and it sent a mile high wall of water running through Los Angeles. At one point, it killed at least 400 people, right? It depends on which study you look at, but like a lot of them were immigrants, a lot of them people that were that you can't keep track of, and things like that, or would never get identified or whatever, and basically worked its way all the way until it washed itself out of the sea. And it's one of things where like I hate to use such a dramatic example of that concept of like, this is the worst thing that could happen from this kind of stuff, and I don't think anybody's getting killed because of bad SEO advice, right? But it kind of paints this picture of like, hey, look, it's I'm sure everybody's got the best intentions for stuff, but there's people that do this for a living, right? That we can actually like hire and do these kind of stuff, and sometimes they do. I mean, some like I know Cirrus was one of the first ones to kind of stand up and say, hey, look, I actually did hire actual mathematicians, actual PhDs to do this kind of stuff. But like, while that kind of like gets around one aspect of it, in the fact that you actually had a real statistician run this data, whatever, all the other things that I kind of brought up in there about the factors of like peer review, and the fact that a tool company sponsored it, and all these kind of things that
just
kind of get
you've got confirmation bias. Like, you you got confirmation bias.
Exactly.
There's a risk of it. Yeah.
It's something where like, if anything like that should have been presented to somebody else, and somebody should have verified it and said like, this is the way it was, or the entire thing should have been like checked for it. Like, and that story, one of the studies that Cirrus referred to, and that we actually brought in a PhD to do it, was one of the ones where he kind of stated, and eventually kind of got in a little bit of trouble with, where we stated that Google+ ones actually like were influencing ranking, right? And he amended it later on, to his credit, because it was like the way he amended it, that article actually became very accurate later on. And there was big chunks of that article that really were truly accurate. Like they actually were doing what they said and it was right to do it. But originally his opening statement was that it was the +1 itself that was doing it. Like Google was actually discounting them and it was making a difference. And he changed that one later on and said, edit, this isn't the way I really meant this and it should have been different. But that, like, that's the problem, right? Is that in that one like little moment in there, you suddenly had thousands of people that basically went out and said, oh, all we have to do is start getting Google +1s and we're money, right? We can do it, you know, and that's where it gets heavy, right? That's where like the ethics of the situation start to break down. And it becomes more than just saying like, hey, look, I'm just a marketer. I'm just a blogger and I'm just having some fun and presenting data and this isn't as cool, to where you're going like, no, you're actually starting to do some damage, right? You know, you're costing companies money. You may get them in trouble, you know, like they may get banned from Google because they did something that it said this is the way to do this stuff. And the problem is it keeps happening, right? Over and over and over again. You get these things to where they, you know, it's that classic like letter of the law versus the spirit of the law type of like things. And where they say, hey, we, you know, it's all right. It's cool. It's like, it's not hurting anybody. It's just SEO, whatever. But it's, you know, it's thousands of dollars. It's people's jobs. It's all kinds of stuff where it just causes problems. And that's where the heart of this thing really came from. But
yeah, it seems like it's a cautionary tale in some ways about the importance of credentials and what that really means, and that there's some rigor involved in getting that credential, and it's supervised by a third party who has no stake in the game. And there has never been, as far as I know, real credentials in my profession. Like as far as I know, I mean, you don't have to take a bar exam, you don't have to take the CPA exam to become an SEO. Anybody can do it. You don't even have to have gone to high school, I don't think. I mean, anybody can become an SEO. Yeah, which is kind of cool. But then when you come out with studies, there is some lack of rigor to these things.
Yeah, it actually kind of blows past all of that, right? You know, like because I don't have any problem with the guys that like maybe they don't have a formal education or whatever. I mean, it's fine, right? It happens all the time, whatever. You know, it's like I wasn't necessarily trained as a writer, even though I wanted to become one, but now I do it now. And I kind of say, hey, I can actually list that I'm a writer. I'm going to, you know, be a published author when my book comes out, things like that. I go, hey, that's fine. I didn't go to school to become a writer, but now I am one technically. And that's cool. You can do that kind of stuff. And there's plenty of other instances where SEOs kind of like take on the mantle of being an SEO and do all the things that are inside of it, all the marketing, all the website architecture, all the public relations type activities that roll up and become like SEO as a thing. And that's fine, right? That one I don't necessarily think is really hurting anybody, right? But when it gets past that, you do kind of start to look at this idea that like, hey, there really are people that are better at certain aspects of this, right? You know, like it's, you know, and, you know, I mentioned I'm writing a book on the subject, and it's actually like, it's the textbook for the class I teach at UCLA, but it's already based on this idea that like, hey, look, it may be time as SEO is growing up here, that it's time to kind of give back some of these aspects, some of these different tactics that are used in SEO, like back to the people that are really good at them to start with, right? You know, so like there are professional writers out there. They write fantastic stuff, right? You know, like it's amazing kind of stuff out there, and it's not that hard to actually teach those writers to go through and say, hey, look, we need you to like focus on like these 2 or 3 things, and congratulations, now you're an SEO person as well, right? You're a writer that knows about SEO rather than an SEO that kind of is good about writing, right? You know, like it's, you know, there's people that build websites, or there's technical people that work for these big companies that do mega sites and things like that, or whatever, that their whole function is like, I'm going to build this fantastic looking website. And you can tell those people that, hey, look, there's a handful of things that this is part of your job now. Like, you know, in addition to these types of things, it's uber important that, you know, that these tags are in place, or that, you know, that the site loads fast, or that you take mobile into account. These things aren't optional anymore. It really has to be there. And same thing goes with public relations people. You know, it's like, you can say, hey, look, you guys are the original link builders, right? Like that's, you know, you're the people who do stuff. Instead, the only, you know, we just don't make sure that, you know, when you get us a link now, just try and link to the the actual product, not to the homepage. Like it's just little kind of stuff you can tell them to do this kind of stuff, right? And that's
I have a buddy who says that all the time. It's like,
yeah,
link building is just PR where you ask for a link. That's it.
Yeah, and they're better at it. They're way so better. Like they're better at building relationships. They're better at all that kind of stuff to it. Everything that you see now, like all the really great articles that are about link building, if you really start to look at it, if you've got any experience in public relations, or if you ask somebody public relations, they'll basically say, well, yeah, you're describing public relations. But they're going back and they're kind of repackaging and reselling it as like, oh, this is link building. He goes, well, no, that's PR. Right, and it's been around since since there were people that could write on walls, right? It's something where it just needs to evolve, and it's fine. But it's something where because I think a certain group of people got to it first. All the tech people got to this idea first, and we're able to pull it in and say, hey, this is actually all ours now, and it's cool, and we're going to claim all these things. We started naming it other things, but you've got people like me that actually were formally trained in marketing or formally trained in whatever, that when I look at that, I'm going, oh, you mean copywriting? Is that what you're actually talking about? Or do you mean like public relations, whatever? Because that has a name already. You don't need to give it a new name, right? We don't need to call it content marketing. We just call that writing. We don't need it
or a modifier. Like it's got to be digital PR.
Yeah,
not just PR. Right?
And that's the one that's killing me later. Is it's digital PR or just PR. It's just PR, right? It's like because this is 2020, and the web's been around for over 25 years, and hey, I think we can stop saying digital and everything. It's just part of the way that we do business. They know how to do these things, and so the book is all about the idea of like retraining people in the idea to where say, hey, look, if you've got the right type of organization for it, you can hand these things back and make yourself like a big, SEO machine, to where, it eventually the concept dies, right? And it's, it's one of the things where like SEO will never die because as long as there's search engines, you'll have SEO around. But this concept that you've got this kind of lone gunman character that is out there like fixing everything for it, that'll fade away. Just like the concept of like a digital marketer will fade away, right? Digital will just become part of the way we always do business, just like TV did eventually, or all these other ones. It's kind of like, well, it's just here, and media planners will just use every tool on the tool chest to do their job. The same thing will go with everything else, to where they'll stop focusing so much on the idea that like, hey, we need to do this for the search engines. It'll be like, hey, we need to do this for our users. And you know what? Nice bonus. The search engines like it. Like it's, so it's a subtle change. It's a whatever, but it's the way the world's going to go. And those are fighting it are the ones that actually have the most to lose from it. So, but
I think that's so true. I saw something. So we met because of our mutual friend, Greg Gifford.
Yeah.
And
big fan of Greg.
Yeah, he's awesome. And he sent me a conversation. I don't know if this is a conversation between you but it's about clicks and engagement. And it's like this question and answer between an SEO and Google.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And they start to go through this dialogue, and all of a sudden Google says, okay, yeah, we're doing what we do evaluate, pogo sticking or whatever it is. And the ultimate line is like, well, what are you going to do differently about this?
Yeah.
So a lot of these things, as long as it leads to an action that you would change some sort of behavior or some sort of strategy on behalf of a client, I think that's cool as hell. I think that's great.
Absolutely.
But if it's just like, well, now I just know a new thing and I caught Google or something like that, and it seems like it's kind of childish.
Well, yeah, exactly. What's the purpose of it? Like if you're, if you found something out that is like, it was truly earth shattering. Like if you found out like that, Google was using something that nobody else thought of, like
that's
it was
cool
something
as hell, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was cool. And they came back and somebody goes, hey, look, we did all the numbers on this stuff, and I'm pretty sure Google is using like local temperature as a ranking factor, like, or something completely out there that nobody's even suggested, right? It goes, it's a thing. I can see it. All the numbers line up. It's whatever. And, and if Google finally came out and said, like, I guess you're right. We were, man, there's no way to ignore that. Like we might as well do it. That would be pretty revolutionary. Like you would have actually caught them to do something. But most of the stuff that's coming up is that they try and say, well, it's clearly, click-through rate is a ranking factor, or bounce rate, or all these kind of stuff. Because it is, just look at it, it's fine. It goes, yeah, but you should be paying attention to that anyway. Like that's just part of your job. That's being a good marketer, as you focus on this stuff. And that's been, if you really think about it, the wave of maybe the last like decade of Google enhancements as far as big changes they go. It's either it's either them telling you like, hey, knock off this shady crap that you've been doing,
Right.
like, because we can
Right.
catch you at it now. Or they're basically telling you like, you know what, you should have been doing this all along, but you're not doing it fast enough. And so now we're going to tell you that you have to do well in the search engine. Right. And you know, everything when it comes down to like site speed or mobile friendliness, or, you know, everything we're going to see with the core web vitals, everything that's all this kind of stuff that's happening too, is like, well, you know, that you should have been doing that, you know, like, and yeah. And it's kind of like, I don't know, you know, I don't want to be too political in it, but it's kind of like it's in our current time where it's the, you know, concept of like wearing a mask when you're out in public. And it's kind of like, well, you shouldn't be arguing against that so much. That's just a pretty smart thing to do, man. You know, like, it's like, you know, wearing a seatbelt, wearing a helmet when you're on a motorcycle, like these things, like these aren't radically big ideas, right? You know, technically the government shouldn't have to tell you to do this kind of stuff. You should do it like, well, you know what, like, you know, the dropouts that come out of my face hole, like that's how you get sick. So maybe I should cover that up before I go outside. You know, like, he goes, well, you know, we would hope you would just do that because you're cool and you don't want to hurt anybody, right? But like it seems like something we need to ask. And Google seems to be the same way, where it's just like, hey, look, we're tired of your slow ass sites, and just it's time to actually like fix this stuff and do whatever. And if you don't, you're not going to rank as well, and that's all there is to it, right? You know?
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Well, let me before I let you go, I've taken a ton of your time. What I do want to hear about this merger. What was it like building an agency to the point where now you are either
part of something else?
Part of something else. So what was that experience like for you?
It was very cool, right? So in this case, we were Fang and Amplitude were partners before this. We had actually done some work together in the past, and different times there were certain things that we had certain strengths in, and vice versa. So we would work together on certain clients, and you know, that's kind of how this relationship got started. And it had been like that 4 years. And they're good people. They were local. Their offices were over in Culver City and things like that. So it was something where we go, hey, look, it's cool. We'd work together. And it had come up a couple times over the years. Like this wasn't even the first time it had been like broached as a thing. And I remember leading up to that, you know, like Fang had gotten to a certain size and it was comfortable. You know, I was paying my people, I was paying myself. I had a nice, like, great living, like, from all this thing. But I was starting to get these calls about like acquisition. People actually wanted to like buy the company from me, and you'd say, well, yeah, we're evaluated at probably at about this. And they go, oh, that's not big enough. You know, like we really need you like here before we can really start to consider you a true acquisition target. And maybe it's because, you know, like I'm getting up, I turned 50 next year, and it's something where I've been in the business a long time and things like that. And so you start to think about like, well, one day selling the company and retiring and things like that is there. It's something that would definitely cross my mind. But can I ever get there? Can I ever get that level on my own? Or is it something where I need partners to actually pull this thing together? And so looking up, they had the team over at Amplitude had asked again and said, you know, is this something you want to think about? And I said, yeah, let's actually have like the serious conversation, what this would look like, what this relationship would do. And you know, you'd appreciate this. We met in the pub 2 or 3 different times, and kind of like hashed it out and kind of said, this is what this looks like, and talked about, you know, different management styles and you know, how we do different things. And, you know, I remember I was really specific with them is that, hey, look, I've gotten in a fantastic routine with my people and how I do business and how I do things. And, you know, idea of like, I wake up crazy early and it gives me all this time to write. And I usually sit out by my pool and do this kind of stuff. And then, you know, start handling things this way. And then I'm done by about this time, and I don't like to be messed with. And that's like my perfect day of what this actually looks like. And he goes, would you guys be cool with something like that? So it was those types of conversations over and over again. And because like, if you were going to come in and say, hey, Jeff, we need to have you coming in the office 5 days a week, or we need to do this kind of stuff, I'm going, well, it's not going to work out because I've gotten to a certain place where this is the way I really like to do stuff. And they said, it's cool. We don't want to change a thing. That's part of your success factors. Let's keep doing this kind of stuff. And vice versa. Like the way that they actually did things, I appreciated that they're highly organized. They did a lot of things that I just never had time to actually get to, as far as how they put things together, certain procedure sets and things like that. So I went, okay, yeah, absolutely. These are fantastic things. Working together would be great. And this was in December of last year when these conversations first started. And we got to the point where we actually started, opening the kimono, as they say, and looking at the details and we started talking finances and valuations and all that kind of stuff. And then COVID hit. Like it was, it was something where, we could start to feel it coming up. It was in the news and building up behind us and things like that. And we said, well, let's just keep this conversation rolling, because we're already kind of like working from home. We had an office over in Culver that they were working out of, and that eventually that got shut down and a bunch of the stuff. But I said, well, let's just keep pushing forward on this stuff. And, it was a real trip to have it all happen at the same time. And then eventually I said, okay, this is it. We've got a deal. Let's sign this paperwork. Let's get this done. And technically it was the beginning of April, where it was like an official thing that actually happened. Meanwhile, like, the entire state is shutting down around us, and,
time to do that deal. Oh my God.
Yeah. And it was, I think this sounds completely selfish, but it was disappointing, because we were going like, well, we don't get to have the big party, there should have been a big party at a bar or something,
right.
There's some kind of big things. And we, it ended up being a Zoom call like this, where we're all holding up beers and going like, hey, welcome to the team. Hey, this is great. And, it was something where we had to get used to it. But now, that we're fully into this and we're into the this massive recession, and business has changed. And, I'm so happy that I've got these guys like in my life, that we're all working together. We're doing our best to hold, fast and this kind of stuff, the people that are paying attention to the financial side of things even more than I would have. And, meanwhile, I can really focus, make sure all the clients are happy and that we're growing and coming through this and doing their best. And it's a real trip. It's something I'd never thought, of the time that I decided to merge with something like this would be the time to do this then. But,
Wow.
yeah, it's a trip. So, and it's probably something you appreciate as a business owner yourself. But
I sure do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Jeff, this has been a ton of fun. I've kept you way longer than I expected at the beginning, but I've loved talking to you. I would point anybody to the article that you wrote in Search Engine Journal that we've been discussing. How else can people stay in touch with you? What's your favorite social media platform? What's the URL for your company?
Sure. So the URL for the company is amplitudeagency.com. You can find us up there. And then I live on Twitter is probably the best way to find me. I go by Count Zero up there just because I've had that handle forever, but it's Zero with an X on that one. So it's pretty easy to find. I love answering questions. If you've got, any thoughts about certain things, or if you want to dig deeper into these articles, that's like we've got the Twitter community that's up on about SEO and things like that is fantastic for the most part. A little toxic in areas, but like just anything else on the internet. But
Sure.
It's something where it's certainly a love. Really talking that kind of shop up there. It's a great place to do it.
For sure. We could trade stories about the toxic part and the positive part next time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jeff, thanks so much for coming on. And, I'll give you a virtual cheers. We'll sign off. And I appreciate it. I'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Search.